At 5:42 a.m. on June 11, 1942, inside a smoke-filled briefing room at the Sasebo Naval District, a row of Japanese admirals studied a set of grainy reconnaissance photos. The projector hummed, casting a pale rectangle of light across the table. In the images lay a single American destroyer, small, narrow, almost toy-like, next to the heavy cruisers and fleet carriers Japan was used to examining. A senior intelligence officer tapped the screen with a lacquered pointer. "This one," he said, exhaling a thin ribbon of smoke, "is called a coast escort, barely 1/4 the displacement of our I-class submarines." A chuckle rolled through the room. Another officer, a veteran of years beneath the waves, leaned in and smirked. "Look at its deck," he said. "No armor, no reach. This vessel will never threaten a submarine that knows how to dive." The admiral at the head of the table took a final drag from his cigarette and crushed it out in a ceramic dish. "American industry builds many things," he murmured, "but this is hardly a warship." Laughter rose again, soft but certain. The room smelled of tobacco and confidence. On the wall maps behind them, the Pacific theater was marked with red arrows sweeping across supply routes. The Imperial Navy expected to dominate for the next several years. No one in the room believed a vessel that small could alter anything. But 3,000 miles away, on the surface of an unsettled stretch of the Pacific, reality was preparing to disagree. That same morning, aboard the tiny American destroyer the Japanese had dismissed, dawn pressed a gray-blue sheen over the water. On the forward deck, 4 sailors in crisp white caps worked in a tight formation around a rack of squat cylindrical launch tubes. Their hands moved fast, oily, practiced, almost rhythmic, as they lifted each Hedgehog projectile into place. The metal clinks echoed across the deck, matching the growing pulse of the ship's engines. Seaman First Class Parker wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "Load it tight," he muttered, settling another round into the launcher. Beside him, Erickson and Malloy mirrored the motion, shoulders brushing in the cramped space. From the bridge above, the voice of the sonar operator cut sharply through the morning calm. "Contact! Bearing 212. Possible sub at 1,800 yards." The sailors froze for half a second, just long enough for the tension to land, then snapped back into motion. Parker dropped the next projectile into place with a solid metallic thud. Chief Carter, standing at the edge of the launcher, glanced down the line of tubes and then toward the horizon, where the sea darkened into a long, low swell. This destroyer wasn't large. It wasn't armored. It didn't carry the prestige or intimidation of the massive warships dominating the Pacific. But on that gray morning in 1942, its crew, working shoulder to shoulder over the very weapons Japan believed were useless, was about to prove just how wrong those admirals had been. Japanese naval doctrine in 1942 revolved around a single ironclad belief that their long-range submarines represented the sharpest cutting edge of undersea warfare. These massive I-class boats, stretching longer than some American destroyers, were engineered with a level of ambition and confidence rarely seen in submarine design during that era. Each vessel carried enough fuel to roam thousands of miles without resupply, giving Japanese commanders the ability to strike at nearly any point across the Pacific with remarkable independence and reach. Their crews were trained to operate as hunters rather than simple scouts, using stealth and long endurance to stalk vulnerable shipping lanes with patience sharpened through months of rigorous preparation. At the core of these submarines' power rested the formidable Type 95 torpedo, a weapon that blended high speed, long range, and a lethal warhead that could cripple even the largest enemy warships with a single catastrophic hit. Japanese officers considered the Type 95 not just a tool but a decisive advantage, believing it allowed their submarines to fight from beyond the limits of American detection systems. These torpedoes ran fast and deep, leaving almost no visible wake, which convinced Japanese strategists that any destroyer foolish enough to challenge their underwater hunters would be struck before it even realized danger was approaching. Confidence in this torpedo bordered on reverence, and its presence shaped many of the assumptions baked into the Imperial Navy's operational planning. The submarines themselves were equipped with advanced optics and powerful diesel engines that allowed them to surface, recharge their batteries quickly, and submerge again with minimal delay. This combination of mobility and stealth formed the backbone of Japan's undersea campaign, which aimed to sever American supply lines and weaken naval formations long before decisive battles unfolded. Japanese commanders viewed the vast Pacific as a game board where their long-range submarines could move freely, while forcing American destroyers to defend convoys stretched thin across thousands of miles of open ocean. These assumptions led to a sense of quiet superiority among Japan's senior officers, who believed their underwater fleet could outlast, outmaneuver, and outfight any destroyer flotilla the United States could deploy. Many of these submarines were staffed by seasoned veterans who had served in earlier conflicts or spent years mastering the demanding technical skills required for deep-water operations. Their discipline was matched only by their conviction that American escort ships lacked both the equipment and the training to pose a serious threat. Japanese crews drilled relentlessly on ambush tactics, practicing approaches in darkness or heavy weather that would allow them to fire a spread of torpedoes before any destroyer could detect their presence. These drills reinforced the belief that submarines held the initiative, while surface ships merely reacted to threats that were already too close to avoid. This confidence grew stronger as Japanese intelligence reports highlighted several perceived weaknesses in American destroyer escorts. Analysts noted the small hull size, limited armor, and cramped deck space, concluding that such ships were unlikely to survive sustained encounters with experienced submarine crews. They expected these small American vessels to be overwhelmed by the superior range and firepower of Japanese torpedoes long before any counterattack could be launched. The prevailing view was that Japanese submarines possessed an insurmountable advantage, one anchored in technology, doctrine, and the unforgiving geometry of underwater warfare. Within this framework, the I-class boats came to symbolize an almost perfect weapon, a synthesis of technical innovation and strategic purpose that Japan believed could shape the course of the Pacific conflict. Senior officers trusted these submarines to disrupt American operations, protect critical supply routes, and eliminate small destroyers with near-effortless precision. Their confidence was so complete that many in the Imperial Navy treated the idea of a tiny American escort ship turning the tables as something bordering on fantasy. Yet deep beneath their certainty lay a flaw they had not considered, a blind spot that would soon collide violently with reality. Japanese naval strategy in 1942 rested heavily on a sweeping doctrine that envisioned their submarines as the silent architects of America's logistical collapse across the Pacific. Senior planners believed that the vast distances separating American naval bases created natural choke points where long-range Japanese submarines could methodically shred convoy routes with minimal resistance. This vision was rooted in decades of naval thinking that prioritized sudden and decisive strikes, executed by elite crews capable of appearing without warning and disappearing before any counterattack could take form. To the Imperial Navy, the Pacific Ocean was not a barrier, but a hunting ground shaped perfectly for their methodical style of submarine warfare. Under this doctrine, Japanese submarines were instructed to form loose wolfpack patterns, allowing each boat to cover a broad swath of ocean, while still remaining close enough to converge on high-value targets. These formations were designed to exploit information from reconnaissance aircraft, surface picket ships, and radio intercepts that revealed the movement of American supply lines. Japanese commanders believed this coordination would allow their submarines to strike with overwhelming effect, firing volleys of torpedoes into convoys that could not defend themselves quickly enough. They expected small destroyer escorts to be scattered thinly across enormous distances, forced to rush from one distress call to another, while never achieving control of the sea. The doctrine emphasized the importance of timing, encouraging submarine captains to attack at dawn or during heavy weather, when American radar and visual detection were least effective. Japanese planners believed that a well-executed ambush under these conditions could eliminate several escort vessels before the surviving ships even understood the direction of the attack. Crews drilled through simulations of these scenarios, developing a sense of confidence that seemed unshakable in the early months of the war. They believed each encounter would follow a predictable rhythm in which Japanese submarines dictated the engagement, while American ships reacted too slowly to survive. Strategic memoranda circulated through naval headquarters outlining precise expectations for how confrontations with American destroyers would unfold. These documents predicted that smaller U.S. escorts, lacking armor and firepower, would withdraw rapidly after losing their first vessel, leaving merchant ships exposed to systematic destruction. Japanese doctrine assumed that morale among American crews would falter quickly, especially when confronted by torpedoes capable of striking from far beyond the range of any countermeasure available at the time. This belief shaped operational planning to such an extent that many submarine captains treated destroyer escorts as secondary nuisances rather than true adversaries. At the heart of this doctrine was the conviction that technological and tactical superiority allowed Japan to control not just the location of battles but their outcome as well. The Imperial Navy envisioned a campaign where American losses would accumulate steadily, undermining the U.S. ability to reinforce distant outposts or supply its carriers for extended operations. Japanese leadership believed that this pressure would force the United States into predictable patterns, allowing their submarines to anticipate and strike supply convoys with increasing accuracy. Months of early war success against unprotected shipping reinforced this confidence and encouraged the belief that Japan's underwater forces could maintain momentum indefinitely. However, the doctrine contained a critical oversight that remained invisible to its architects. It assumed that American destroyer escorts would fight according to rigid procedures, responding to submarine threats with the cautious, predictable maneuvers prescribed in their training manuals. Japanese planners underestimated the possibility that individual American crews might innovate under fire, adapt rapidly to chaotic conditions, or abandon textbook tactics entirely. This assumption would prove dangerously flawed when confronted by a tiny American destroyer whose crew had no intention of fighting the way their enemies expected. In the minds of Japanese strategists, the Pacific battlefield resembled a giant mathematical diagram where submarines held every advantage and American escorts existed merely as moving obstacles. Yet, beneath the sweeping arrows and carefully plotted patrol zones, lay a truth the doctrine never accounted for. War is shaped not only by technology and planning, but by the sheer unpredictability of human ingenuity. Soon, one small destroyer would expose the limits of a strategy built on certainty, revealing that the ocean favored not the strongest doctrine but the most adaptable crew. Japanese intelligence officers in mid-1942 believed their assessments of American destroyer escorts were both thorough and unquestionably accurate, relying on a mixture of intercepted reports, outdated naval registries, and hastily analyzed reconnaissance photographs. Their conclusions were presented with such confidence that few within the Imperial Navy questioned the assumptions underlying them, particularly when the information appeared to reinforce long-held beliefs about American shipbuilding priorities. Analysts noted the small silhouette of the newer U.S. escort vessels and interpreted the compact hull design as further evidence that these ships lacked the endurance and firepower necessary to challenge seasoned submarine crews operating deep in contested waters. This view quickly hardened into doctrine, driven by the widespread belief that American naval planners prioritized mass production over refined engineering, especially when rushing smaller ships into wartime service. Japanese officers repeatedly emphasized the thin plating visible along the destroyer's waterlines, arguing that any torpedo hit would inevitably cause catastrophic flooding. These assessments were circulated through command channels, with concise summaries that left little room for debate, establishing a perception that American escorts were nothing more than modest patrol craft, unable to survive encounters with well-coordinated submarine attacks. Technical analysts added fuel to this skepticism by focusing on what the destroyers seemingly lacked, rather than what they might conceal beneath their modest exterior. Reports highlighted the absence of heavy deck guns, the limited ammunition storage, and the narrow beam that appeared to restrict stability during high-speed maneuvers. Each detail reinforced the notion that these ships were designed for cost efficiency rather than combat resilience, creating an image of vessels destined to crumble under pressure. Japanese officers confidently presented these findings during briefings, portraying the American escort fleet as a hastily assembled collection of underpowered ships ill-suited for contested waters. Sonar capability, a critical factor in anti-submarine warfare, received particular scrutiny from Japanese intelligence teams, who believed American technology lagged at least a generation behind their expectations for modern naval detection systems. Analysts argued that the compact size of the destroyers left little space for advanced acoustic equipment, and they cited intercepted radio chatter, suggesting difficulties with calibration and maintenance. These observations convinced Japanese planners that their submarines could remain undetected long enough to position themselves for deadly ambushes, striking with confidence before any destroyer could close the distance. Additional intelligence reports claimed that the small crew complements aboard American escorts limited their ability to sustain around-the-clock anti-submarine operations. Japanese officers assumed that fewer sailors meant slower response times, reduced watch rotations, and increased fatigue during long patrols. These assumptions fed into the broader conclusion that American destroyer crews would be overwhelmed by the relentless demands of undersea warfare. By contrast, Japanese submarine crews were celebrated for their endurance, discipline, and readiness to operate for weeks without resupply, attributes that further established their perceived superiority. All of these assessments converged into a unified picture of American escort ships as flimsy, slow-reacting, and technologically inferior opponents that could be eliminated with minimal risk. Japanese planners confidently predicted that these small destroyers would retreat after sustaining even minor damage, leaving convoys exposed to subsequent torpedo attacks. This belief framed every engagement scenario, reinforcing the assumption that Japan's underwater fleet held an uncontested tactical advantage that required little adaptation or innovation. What Japanese analysts failed to consider, however, was the evolving nature of American ship design and the surprising effectiveness of new anti-submarine weapons quietly entering service. They overlooked the possibility that crews aboard toy-sized destroyers might compensate for limited size with exceptional coordination, aggressive maneuvering, and improvised tactics that defied conventional expectations. Most critically, they never imagined that a small escort ship dismissed as insignificant and fragile could become a formidable opponent through sheer adaptability and determination. This blind spot would soon unravel the carefully constructed confidence that underpinned Japanese strategy, revealing that their threat assessment ignored the most unpredictable variable in war: a crew willing to fight far beyond what the specifications on paper suggested. At 6:18 a.m., on June 12, 1942, the small American destroyer cut across a restless stretch of Pacific water, its bow rising and falling with a steady rhythm that mirrored the quiet determination of the crew working along the forward deck. The sun had only begun to lift above the horizon, casting pale bands of gold across the steel-gray surface and illuminating the rows of Hedgehog launch tubes arranged like a set of silent promises along the ship's narrow bow section. 4 sailors moved quickly between them, lifting each projectile with practiced confidence earned through long weeks of drills that left their arms aching and their uniforms permanently marked with grease and salt. The morning wind carried the sharp scent of diesel exhaust mixed with the faint tang of seawater, while the thrum of engines vibrated through the deck plates beneath the sailors' boots. Overhead, the ship's bridge loomed like a watchful guardian, its windows glowing faintly as the officers scanned the wavering horizon for the slightest sign of trouble. Below them, inside the dark confines of the sonar compartment, a 19-year-old operator leaned forward over his console, adjusting the dials with the careful precision of someone who knew each ping could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. On deck, Seaman First Class Parker braced his feet against the slight tilt of the ship as he guided another Hedgehog round into its tube, feeling the familiar scrape of metal against metal as the projectile settled into place. His teammates, Erickson and Malloy, mirrored his movements, forming a tightly coordinated rhythm that allowed them to work efficiently despite the cramped space and the unpredictable motion of the sea. Chief Carter oversaw the process with the steady gaze of a veteran sailor who had seen enough action to understand the importance of readiness, especially on a vessel small enough to be dismissed by its enemies. The destroyer's deck felt unusually tense that morning, as if the air itself anticipated something approaching from beneath the water's shifting surface. A distant swell broke against the hull, sending a cool spray across the sailor's sleeves and making Parker glance instinctively toward the starboard side, where the sea glimmered with an unsettling stillness. Although they had rehearsed this scene countless times, the reality of preparing for a potential submarine threat weighed heavily on each man, sharpening their awareness and quickening their movements. Below deck, the sonar operator adjusted his headset again, listening for the faint echo pattern he had been tracing over the last several minutes. He detected a subtle irregularity, a barely perceptible distortion in the returning signal that hinted at an object moving with deliberate caution beneath the waves. His heartbeat quickened as he recalibrated the gain, hoping the anomaly was merely a school of fish or some drifting debris stirred up by the currents. Yet the sound persisted, growing slightly more defined with each sweep of the transducer, suggesting something far more deliberate and potentially dangerous. The tension finally broke when the operator leaned toward his microphone and reported the contact with a voice steadier than he felt, announcing a bearing that sliced through the morning calm like a sudden gust of wind. His words traveled up through the communication lines and into the bridge, where the watch officer stiffened, scanning the horizon as though expecting the invisible threat to reveal itself above the surface. The message was relayed instantly to Chief Carter, who lifted his head from the launchers and signaled for his men to stand ready, their hands hovering over the tubes with renewed focus. As the destroyer adjusted its heading to investigate the contact, the rising sun cast a brighter light across the launch deck, highlighting the determined faces of the sailors preparing for whatever might unfold in the next few minutes. Though small and often overlooked, this ship carried a crew willing to push beyond routine and confront an enemy that believed them incapable of mounting any serious challenge. In that moment, with the Hedgehog tubes loaded and the suspicion of a submarine lurking beneath the waves, the destroyer moved with a purpose that would soon defy every expectation the Japanese Navy had confidently embraced. The tiny destroyer moved steadily through the morning swell as the heartbeat of the ship echoed faintly beneath the steel deck, reminding every man aboard that their survival depended on coordination rather than size or firepower. Despite its modest displacement, the vessel carried a crew defined not by rank or reputation, but by a stubborn shared belief that they could outthink any danger lurking beneath the waves. The officers on the bridge rotated calmly through their stations, tracing the contact's bearing with a mixture of caution and determination that reflected months of demanding patrols along contested waters. Their discipline formed the backbone of the ship's combat readiness, shaping decisions that would soon push the vessel far beyond what its specifications promised. At the center of this tight-knit crew stood Lieutenant James Harland, a young but remarkably composed commanding officer whose steady voice carried a quiet authority that reassured his men during every tense encounter. Harland was known for his refusal to rely solely on the prescribed tactics found in outdated manuals, preferring instead to adapt quickly whenever circumstances shifted unexpectedly. His calm confidence earned the trust of his crew, who followed his orders with the certainty that he understood both the strengths and limitations of their small ship. Though he lacked the years of experience possessed by many Japanese commanders, Harland compensated with a strategic flexibility that allowed him to recognize opportunities even in the most uncertain situations. Beneath the bridge, the sonar compartment belonged to Seaman Robert Wexler, a 19-year-old operator with a natural ear for acoustic patterns that many older sailors quietly admired. Wexler's skill came not from seniority, but from an unusual ability to distinguish subtle variations in underwater noise, allowing him to detect faint echoes others might dismiss as interference. Long nights spent listening to the rhythmic sweep of the sonar had sharpened his instinct until he could sense when something beneath the surface moved with deliberate purpose. His youth made him easy to overlook, yet every man aboard understood that his precision often provided the crucial few seconds needed to prepare for an approaching threat. On the forward deck, Seaman First Class Parker served as the backbone of the Hedgehog crew, guiding his team with the sure-handed confidence of someone who had spent countless hours mastering an unforgiving weapon. Parker moved with a calm intensity that influenced Erickson and Malloy, who mirrored his actions with near-synchronized precision even under shifting seas. Their routine, practiced until muscles responded without conscious thought, allowed them to load the launchers faster than most crews on larger destroyers. This efficiency transformed the ship's modest weapon system into something unexpectedly formidable, capable of delivering rapid and concentrated attacks that surprised even seasoned officers. Chief Petty Officer Carter, who supervised the deck operations, provided the grounding force that held these younger sailors together. His years at sea had taught him the value of discipline tempered by adaptability, a combination he saw reflected in the way his crew managed the tight coordination required for anti-submarine missions. Carter recognized that the destroyer's survival depended on teamwork rather than brute strength, and he drilled his men relentlessly until their movements became second nature. He seldom raised his voice, except when urgency demanded it, choosing instead to lead through steady assurance that kept his crew focused and level-headed. Together, these men formed a unit far greater than the sum of their individual roles, united by the shared understanding that their small ship required every ounce of effort they could muster. The destroyer lacked the imposing presence of the larger vessels dominating the Pacific, yet its crew compensated through relentless practice, improvisation, and an unyielding belief in one another's capabilities. As the contact reported by Wexler grew more defined on the sonar screen, each man sensed that the moment ahead would test them in ways no drill had fully prepared them for. Yet none hesitated, because they trusted in their training, their ship, and the quiet determination of a crew that refused to be dismissed as insignificant by any enemy. The steady hum of the destroyer's engines blended with the soft hiss of wind sweeping across the bow as the crew braced themselves for whatever lay beneath the shifting surface. In the sonar compartment, Seaman Robert Wexler leaned closer to his headset, adjusting the sensitivity with slow, deliberate motions as he tracked the faint echo pulsing through the speaker. The sound repeated at irregular intervals, each return sharpening his suspicion that the contact was neither drifting debris nor harmless marine life. He tightened his grip on the control wheel, sensing the subtle undercurrent of intent hidden within the echo's timing, an unmistakable signature he had learned to recognize during countless hours spent listening to the ocean's rhythm. Lieutenant Harland stood over the sonar repeater on the bridge, watching the operator's readings shift steadily into a pattern that demanded immediate attention. The small, pulsing mark on the display carried the unmistakable cadence of metal moving through deep water, and Harland felt a familiar tension tighten across his shoulders as he considered the implications. He issued a quiet order to maintain current speed while adjusting the ship's heading slightly, ensuring they approached the contact at an angle that preserved both maneuverability and sonar clarity. His officers responded with crisp precision, their voices steady as they repeated the commands through the ship's internal circuits. Below, Wexler recalibrated the gain and focused on the echo's secondary harmonics, confirming that the object's movement aligned with a deliberate course rather than random drift. He recognized the particular fluctuation caused by a submarine adjusting depth, a telltale shift he had only heard during practice drills or simulated training sessions. The realization struck him with a mix of excitement and dread, prompting him to deliver a clear, controlled report through the microphone. His voice carried up through the steel corridors, reaching the bridge with a calm urgency that immediately shifted the crew's posture. Chief Carter heard the report echo through the deck speakers and signaled for his Hedgehog team to stand ready, their hands hovering near the loaded projectiles with renewed focus. Parker and his men exchanged brief nods, understanding that their practiced rhythm would soon be tested under the pressure of a real encounter. The air around them seemed to thicken with anticipation, as though the entire ship held its breath while waiting for the enemy's next move. Each man braced himself for the moment when training would collide with the unpredictable demands of combat. Lieutenant Harland absorbed Wexler's details before issuing a new sequence of commands, instructing the helm to maintain a tracking course that kept the destroyer aligned with the submarine's direction of travel. He knew the enemy vessel might be attempting to reposition for an attack, using the deep layers of the ocean to mask its approach while seeking the perfect angle to launch a torpedo. Harland's strategy required caution without hesitation, balancing the need for precise detection against the risk of drawing too close before understanding the submarine's intentions. His voice remained calm as he relayed instructions, reinforcing the quiet confidence that defined his leadership. On the sonar screen, the contact strengthened gradually, confirming that the submarine was indeed closing the distance with methodical precision. Wexler monitored the range numbers, noting how the echoes compressed with each sweep of the transducer, forming a distinct pattern that reflected steady forward motion. He detected slight variations that suggested the submarine was adjusting course, possibly preparing to slip beneath the destroyer's defensive envelope and gain a more advantageous firing position. This realization forced him to report again, urging the bridge to consider the possibility that the enemy was already preparing to strike. Harland listened to the update and felt the stakes crystallize around a single, uncomfortable truth. The submarine had discovered them first, and its captain was maneuvering with intent. The destroyer's small size might have offered stability and speed, but it also meant they had little margin for error if the enemy launched torpedoes at close range. Harland's jaw tightened as he issued orders to ready the depth charge crew along the stern, while keeping the Hedgehog team poised for immediate action. The ship responded with a surge of coordinated movement, every sailor shifting into the roles they had rehearsed countless times. As the morning light brightened across the Pacific, the destroyer's crew prepared for the inevitable confrontation, their senses sharpened by the knowledge that the submarine lurking below possessed both reach and lethality. Yet, despite the danger rising beneath them, no man aboard hesitated, because each understood that their unity, discipline, and quiet resourcefulness formed the true strength of their small vessel. The first contact had been made, and the unfolding minutes would reveal whether their resolve could overcome an enemy confident in its superiority. Lieutenant Harland studied the shifting sonar trace with a tightening focus, recognizing the unmistakable pattern of a submarine attempting to slide beneath their defensive arc and gain a decisive attacking position. He knew that following the standard anti-submarine procedures would leave the destroyer reacting too slowly to outmaneuver a skilled enemy captain who clearly understood how to exploit the predictable habits of American escorts. The manual dictated a cautious closing rate, a slow adjustment of course, and a rigid timing of depth charge preparations that rarely allowed smaller ships to seize the initiative. Harland understood these rules had been written for larger vessels with more powerful detection equipment, not for a lean destroyer designed to strike quickly and rely on agility rather than armor. He stepped closer to the bridge wing, narrowing his eyes against the bright lift of the morning sun, while he weighed the consequences of abandoning the textbook approach. The officers around him waited for instructions, fully aware that conventional tactics might allow the submarine to slip into a lethal firing angle before the destroyer could respond. Harland felt the heavy pressure of expectation, sensing the precarious balance between bold improvisation and reckless risk. He inhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts as he considered the unique strengths of his ship, remembering how its compact frame allowed abrupt course changes that larger escorts struggled to execute with accuracy. Wexler's next sonar report confirmed the submarine's steady attempt to reposition, revealing a subtle but deliberate drift to port that suggested a classic approach for launching a spread of torpedoes. Harland recognized the maneuver from training diagrams, yet understood that the Japanese captain would expect the destroyer to maintain its predictable search pattern rather than challenge the submarine's initiative. In that realization, Harland found his decision forming with sharp clarity, driven by the knowledge that surprise remained the one advantage his small ship could wield effectively. He turned toward the helm with a firm expression, ready to issue the unorthodox command. "Bring us to flank speed and initiate a hard starboard swing," he ordered, speaking with a calm decisiveness that belied the risk he was assuming. The helm officer hesitated for only a fraction of a second, fully aware that such a maneuver would distort the sonar readings and temporarily blind the destroyer to the submarine's exact position. Harland countered that concern with a level tone, reminding his officers that disrupting the enemy captain's expectations would buy them the precious seconds required to strike first. The engines roared as the ship surged forward, its bow cutting sharply across the rolling waves, while the deck vibrated with the sudden increase in power. On the forward deck, Chief Carter braced himself as the destroyer banked into its aggressive turn, signaling Parker and his crew to maintain readiness, despite the unpredictable motion. The Hedgehog team adjusted their footing while gripping the launch tubes, their muscles tense but steady as they awaited Harland's next command. The abrupt maneuver caught the submarine by surprise, producing an unexpected distortion in the sonar returns that momentarily masked its exact trajectory. Yet Harland had anticipated this moment, understanding that the sudden shift in the destroyer's position would force the submarine captain to abandon his approach and adapt under pressure. Wexler struggled to maintain clarity on the rapidly shifting contact, carefully adjusting the gain until the echo stabilized into a faint trace, reflecting the submarine's attempt to compensate for the unexpected move. He relayed the updated bearing to the bridge with renewed urgency, prompting Harland to transition immediately into the second phase of his improvised tactic. The captain ordered a rapid transition to an oblique approach vector, intending to cut directly across the submarine's projected path before the enemy captain could complete his evasive dive. The destroyer responded with remarkable agility, banking again as it surged forward through the rising swell. As the ship settled into its new heading, the bridge crew sensed that the moment for decisive action was approaching with daunting speed. Harland tightened his grip on the railing, listening intently to Wexler's updates as the sonar trace grew stronger with each passing second. The submarine had lost the initiative, forced into reactive movement by a maneuver no manual would have recommended. Harland exhaled slowly, recognizing that the success of his gamble now depended on perfect timing from the Hedgehog crew waiting tensely on the deck below. With the destroyer closing in and the ocean echoing with rising tension, the stage was set for a clash neither side could avoid. The destroyer surged into its new attack vector with a momentum that sent vibrations through every steel beam, signaling the crew that the decisive moment had finally arrived. Wexler monitored the sonar trace intensely, watching the pulsing echo sharpen into the tight, rhythmic signature of a submarine trying desperately to escape the unexpected approach. He called out the updated range with a voice that carried both urgency and precision, allowing Lieutenant Harland to gauge the perfect moment to deliver the first strike. Harland steadied himself beside the chart table, understanding that the ship had only seconds to seize the advantage before the submarine slipped beneath another temperature layer and vanished into acoustic obscurity. On the forward deck, Chief Carter raised his arm sharply, signaling Parker's Hedgehog team to prepare for immediate launch despite the constant spray crashing across the bow. The destroyer's aggressive maneuvering had created a rolling deck that demanded unwavering focus from the crew, yet each man responded with the calm discipline honed through countless hours of practice. Parker secured his footing as he verified the firing sequence, ensuring the projectiles were locked into place with the precision required for the upcoming strike. Erickson and Malloy mirrored his movements silently, their faces set with the determined concentration of sailors who understood the gravity of the moment. Harland waited until Wexler's next update confirmed the narrowing distance, recognizing the precise timing window in which the Hedgehog pattern would fall directly across the submarine's projected path. He issued the firing order with a controlled sharpness that cut cleanly through the volatile air, prompting Carter to deliver the command that sent the first salvo arcing into the sky. A rapid series of metallic thumps echoed across the deck as 24 projectiles launched forward, their trajectories forming a deadly grid that sank swiftly into the churning waters ahead. The crew braced themselves, knowing the Hedgehog's silent descent offered no immediate explosion unless it found its target. Seconds stretched into a tense stillness before a sudden cluster of underwater detonations erupted in a muffled roar that thumped deeply through the hull. The destroyer shuddered as the shockwave rolled beneath it, followed by a rising plume of dark oil that surfaced through the broken swell several moments later. Wexler confirmed the disappearance of the original Echo, prompting a rare murmur of relief among the crew as they acknowledged the destruction of the first submarine. Harland allowed himself a brief exhale, yet he knew the hunt was far from finished, since other enemy vessels were likely operating nearby. That night, under a low blanket of fog that blurred the horizon into a pale smear of silver, Wexler picked up another faint contact moving slowly across their sector. The crew returned instantly to their stations, driven by the lingering adrenaline of the earlier victory, and the recognition that the second submarine might be attempting to avenge the first. Harland maneuvered the destroyer with deliberate unpredictability, denying the enemy the opportunity to anticipate their course while maintaining pressure on the slowly tightening sonar trace. The ship pushed through uneven waters as Carter's team reloaded the launchers with a practiced intensity that seemed almost mechanical in its perfection. When the contact clarified into a firm bearing, Harland executed a sharp turn designed to compress the distance before the submarine could complete its dive to deeper layers. Carter signaled the launch without hesitation, sending another spread of Hedgehog rounds descending into the dark water in a pattern designed to corner the fleeing vessel. Moments later, a second series of underwater blasts reverberated through the destroyer's frame, washing over the deck like distant thunder rolling beneath the sea. Oil and fragments surfaced soon afterward, confirming that the second submarine had been eliminated with equal decisiveness. The third encounter arrived the following afternoon, when a sonar return flickered across Wexler's screen with irregular timing that suggested an enemy captain attempting to mask his approach behind shifting currents. Harland interpreted the pattern quickly, recognizing it as a calculated attempt to slip beneath their stern and target the destroyer's propulsion with a well-placed torpedo. Before the submarine could finalize its attack vector, Harland ordered a high-speed turn that threw off the enemy's calculations and positioned the destroyer directly above its projected path. Carter responded instantly, unleashing a final barrage that plunged deep before detonating in a violent underwater bloom that shook the ship from bow to stern. As debris and oil rose to the surface once more, the crew stood in quiet disbelief, understanding they had accomplished something few destroyers had ever achieved within such a short window. In just 48 hours, a ship the enemy dismissed as insignificant had dismantled 3 submarines through discipline, innovation, and unwavering resolve. The hunt was over, yet the echoes of those explosions would soon travel far beyond the empty horizon. News of the first submarine's disappearance reached the Sasebo communications office late in the evening, carried by a fragmented and increasingly anxious series of signals that stopped abruptly before the watch officer could request clarification. The loss seemed improbable, yet the silence that followed created an unsettling pause in the normally disciplined rhythm of undersea communications. Senior officers initially dismissed the incident as a mechanical failure or radio malfunction, believing their highly trained crews would never allow a routine engagement to end without transmitting a detailed report. The uncertainty lingered, however, casting a faint shadow across the operations board that tracked each submarine's planned movements. By the following morning, the second disappearance forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their assumptions, especially when the distress signal ended mid-transmission with a sudden crackle that suggested a catastrophic event beneath the surface. Officers gathered around the operations map, tracing the expected routes of their submarines, while arguing over potential explanations that did not yet include enemy action. Some believed an unexpected geological feature might have caused a collision, while others theorized that a malfunctioning torpedo could have detonated prematurely. Their reluctance to acknowledge the possibility of a successful American attack reflected a deep-rooted confidence in their vessels, a belief that overshadowed even the mounting evidence of disaster. As the reports accumulated, the tension inside the command center thickened, slowly eroding the quiet certainty that had defined the earlier days of the campaign. When the third submarine failed to make its scheduled check-in, a heavy silence settled across the room, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of pencils against the lacquered surface of the plotting table. An intelligence officer reviewed the timing of the losses and noted the disturbing pattern that placed all three disappearances within the same sector over an extremely compressed period. His voice wavered as he proposed the possibility of an enemy vessel operating with greater precision than previously believed, prompting skeptical glances from senior officers unwilling to accept such an unsettling implication. Admiral Tanaka, a veteran of multiple campaigns, stood motionless as he studied the map, his expression shifting from irritation to disbelief as the implications of the pattern became impossible to ignore. He demanded the most recent reconnaissance data from nearby patrol aircraft, hoping to identify any sign of American activity that might explain the rapid sequence of losses. The reports returned empty, however, revealing only scattered wake patterns consistent with routine shipping, and no indication of a large escort group capable of coordinating such decisive attacks. The absence of a clear threat only deepened the confusion, leaving Tanaka to confront the uncomfortable possibility that a single enemy ship had somehow disrupted their undersea dominance. Communications officers attempted repeatedly to hail the missing submarines, sending coded bursts across multiple frequencies while adjusting signal strength to compensate for potential interference. Each attempt was met only with static that grew louder as the minutes passed, echoing through the command center like a quiet indictment of their fading control. Junior officers exchanged uneasy looks, recognizing that the disappearance of 3 submarines in such a short span challenged the very doctrine that had shaped their confidence in the underwater fleet. Their training had prepared them for losses, yet nothing in the manuals addressed the possibility that an enemy vessel might strike so effectively and so quickly. When a final intelligence summary arrived, confirming a rising trail of oil slicks along the sector where the submarines had last reported, the mood in the command center shifted decisively from confusion to shock. Tanaka lowered the report slowly, his hands tightening around the edges of the paper as he realized the full weight of what had occurred. The summary hinted strongly at deliberate action, describing the distribution of debris as consistent with precise anti-submarine attacks rather than mechanical failure. An aide nervously suggested that American aircraft might be responsible, but Tanaka dismissed the idea, knowing the pattern did not match the behavior of aerial bombs or depth charges. Instead, he found himself confronting a far more disturbing conclusion. Somewhere in the vast Pacific, a small American destroyer had outmaneuvered and eliminated 3 submarines that had been considered near invincible. The realization cracked through the command center with the quiet force of an unexpected betrayal, unraveling months of confidence built upon assumptions of technological superiority. Tanaka stood in silence as the implications sank deeper, understanding that this single ship had not only destroyed 3 submarines, but had also shattered the foundation of certainty that underpinned their entire undersea strategy. For the first time in the campaign, the Japanese Navy acknowledged a threat they had never imagined, a tiny American vessel capable of overturning their expectations with deadly precision. The disappearance of 3 submarines within such a compressed timeline sent ripples of unease through the Japanese naval hierarchy, forcing officers to reevaluate assumptions that had previously seemed unshakable. In the days that followed, analysts pored over the surviving communication logs, sketching timelines, and estimated positions across large maps that now bore marks of uncertainty rather than confidence. Their calculations revealed a troubling consistency, suggesting that the submarines had been attacked with a level of precision rarely attributed to American escort vessels. This discovery challenged the very structure of their earlier assessments, creating a growing awareness that an unseen threat had emerged unexpectedly within the Pacific theater. Operational planners, once convinced of Japan's clear superiority in undersea warfare, found themselves questioning the reliability of their patrol routes and the effectiveness of long-standing tactics. They realized that the ambush patterns employed by their submarines left predictable traces that a well-trained enemy might exploit, especially if that enemy possessed sharper detection capabilities than previously believed. Discussions inside the naval headquarters took on a more urgent tone as officers debated whether the American escorts had received